tug-of-war between nations turns into a game of hurry up and wait. The clock is ticking on a diplomatic deadlock between Tehran and Washington as each side waits for the other to make the first move. Which president will blink first, Hassan Rouhani or Joe Biden? I'm Adi Janayanar, and today's newsmaker is the stalled Iran nuclear deal. It's a diplomatic version of Catch-22 being played out on an international scale. The U.S. says Iran must first return to the negotiating table with full compliance before it lifts sanctions. Tehran says Washington needs to lift sanctions before it even thinks about pulling up a chair. America insists Iran concede first. Iran insists the more America procrastinates, the more it stands to lose. President Hassan Rouhani only has a few months left in office, and with a hardliner likely to replace him after the June elections, the future of the deal is uncertain. So, what comes next? Will U.S. President Joe Biden be able to convince his domestic audience to make concessions after Iran so boldly contravened parts of the agreement? And can Tehran push an agreement through before those who long resisted it take power? I'll speak to that about our guests in just a moment, but first, Natalie Pohanen has more on the players involved and what it could take to end this geopolitical stalemate.
Not even the coronavirus pandemic could put a stop to marking the anniversary of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. As much as this is a day about history, there's also a sense that the country could be on the precipice of a diplomatic breakthrough with its once sworn enemy, the United States. In recent years, ordinary citizens have grappled with the economic fallout of sanctions imposed on Iran after the Trump administration abandoned the 2015 nuclear deal. But there is new US leadership now, and that's brought a sense of cautious optimism to the surface.
If the sanctions are lifted, well, the lives of the people will be easier and our progress will increase. But these sanctions have also, in a way, made us stand on our own 2 feet, and in a way, sever our dependence on other countries.
If the US continues on the same path it's taking now, we'll be like two parallel lines, and we will have no conclusion, and a relationship with the US is not feasible. But if the US stops its conceitedness, there is hope to have relations with them.
Now comes the waiting game as Iran calls on the US to make the first move and return to the agreement.
ما آماده‌ایم هر روزی که آمریکا به تعهدات کامل خود در برجام برگرده، ما هم همه تعهدات برجامی خود را اجرا کنیم و عمل کنیم.
But before that happens, there are some major hurdles for both sides to cross, because Iran has carried out actions that were banned under the 2015 nuclear accords. An International Atomic Energy Agency report says Iran has produced uranium metal, a material that could be used to make the core of an atomic weapon. It's also resumed enriching uranium to 20%. That's a short technical step away from weapons-grade enrichment levels. The Iranians started breaking parts of the deal after the US abandoned it in 2018 and reinstituted sanctions. Tehran says it will reverse the violations when the US returns to the original agreement. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA, was signed in 2015. It was a deal between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. Under the agreement, Tehran promised to scale back its uranium enrichment and allowed the international nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, to inspect its facilities. In exchange, sanctions were lifted, allowing Iran to resume trading oil and gas on the international market. It was seen as a win for world peace. But the agreement did not address Iran's ballistic missile tests or its role in regional conflicts. This is also the tale of 3 presidents. The JCPOA was a defining feature of Barack Obama's presidency. Donald Trump campaigned on tearing it up, and when he took office, withdrew the US from the deal. How Joe Biden manages the next phase of the deal could well become a defining foreign policy of his administration.
Will the U.S. lift sanctions first in order to get Iran back to the negotiating table?
No.
They have to stop enriching uranium first.
While Biden's team has indicated the US will return to the deal if Iran returns to full compliance, they view it as just the first step to securing a broader arrangement.
We will seek to lengthen and strengthen its provisions, including vis-a-vis the nuclear provisions, using it as a platform to then negotiate follow-on agreements that would address Iran's other malign activity.
Tehran is insisting that this is about restoring the 2015 deal, which the US broke, not adding amendments. It says the window to do that is fast disappearing.
Soon, my government will be compelled to take further remedial action in response to the American and European dismal failure to live up to their commitment under the nuclear deal.
The Iranian parliament has set a February 21 deadline for the US to lift sanctions. Otherwise, the government will block IAEA inspections at nuclear sites and increase uranium enrichment. Iran is also headed for a presidential election in June. Rouhani has reached his term limit and a new president will take office. While neither side has taken their seat at the renegotiating table, the clock has already started counting down. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
All right, to talk about the future of the nuclear deal, let's go to our panel. Joining me now from London is Holly Dagres. She is an Iranian-American analyst and a senior fellow over at the Atlantic Council. Matthew Brodsky joins us now from Washington, D.C. He's a Middle East analyst, also a senior fellow, this time at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. And in Philadelphia is John Kazvinian, whose book, America and Iran, A History 1720 to the Present, was released just last month. Welcome to all of you, and John, congratulations on the book. Holly, let me begin with you. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, says their stance is final and irreversible. Joe Biden, on the other hand, says that Iran must make concessions to return to the negotiating table. I think you see the fundamental problem here, and the central problem in reviving this deal is this: who goes first?
I think that's one of the questions both sides are asking, and the reality is that this all started when former President Donald Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement in 2018 because he hoped to get a better deal than his predecessor. And unfortunately, that resulted in a failed maximum pressure policy that has neither changed Iran's behavior or collapsed the government. And here we are in a new administration in 2021. And now both sides are saying which one should go first. Well, if we look closely at the technicalities that are involved in the Iran nuclear agreement, according to Article 26, the Iranians technically had a right to withdraw from all or some aspects of the Iran deal if sanctions are reimposed, which is exactly what happened under the Trump administration. So logically speaking, given everything that's been said, the Iranians are, to an extent, arguably correct to say that the United States should be moving forward first. And that doesn't mean something big. It means something like a baby step. And from my understanding, the Biden administration is actually considering such things at the moment.
All right. Matthew, you heard Holly there. I mean, one, does it matter who goes first? And is Iran correct, even if it's just baby steps that need to be taken by the U.S.?
Well, first of all, your guest is right, is that according to the deal, any infraction, we're talking about anything at all from a visa restriction to enriching uranium to 20%. The only penalty that was called for in the nuclear agreement was for the the United States and other powers to withdraw from the pact and for Iran to tear up the entire agreement. That was one of many central flaws in the agreement. Now, as to who goes first, you're basically arguing over who gets to take shelter and run into a house that has no roof to begin with in a storm. The nuclear deal does not actually address its nuclear program, much less address its ballistic missiles and its terrorism. The fact is, all of the provisions have sunset clauses that start to peel away in the next coming years. So the fact that we're talking about whether Iran is allowed or able to enrich uranium to whatever level, the fact is they're allowed to do that in a few years' time because the agreement was so bad to begin with. And finally, I would add to it that the way Iran has been able to so quickly enrich uranium now up to 20%, getting out of the deal and to do this quickly, demonstrates just how bad the deal was to begin with, that Iran could violate it and, frankly, get itself to within a few months of having a nuclear weapon, which, again, is a program they even lied about in the U.S. under Obama, didn't really seek to make sure that they had a nuclear weaponization program. Now we know that they've had that with irrefutable proof that, thankfully, Israel's Mossad brought out. So we should not be anxious to get back into the deal. The deal itself is flawed to begin with and does not prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
All right, Matthew, I do understand your position or your stance on the landmark deal, but John, let me turn to you. I mean, a house with no roof, I mean, just because a deal doesn't address a particular country's ballistic program and its role in the region, does it mean that it cannot prevent the country from developing nuclear weapons?
Yeah, this is a sort of a fascinating argument that we hear often from opponents, not just opponents of the Iran nuclear deal, but people who are actually opponents of the idea of closer relations between Iran and the United States, between Iran and the European powers, people who are opposed to the idea of Iran being allowed back into the community of nations and ending its isolation. That is what they're actually really afraid of, not the idea that Iran is going to build a nuclear weapon. The Israelis know this, the Americans know this, the Russians know this, everyone knows this. The Iranians have never actually been seriously interested in a nuclear weapon. That's extremely clear from all of the intelligence going back many, many years. The issue with the nuclear deal, you know, it's funny because oftentimes the same people who say, oh, that it's a house with no roof or, you know, that it doesn't address Iran's larger pattern of behavior in this area or that area, ballistic missiles or proxy militias or so on, are the same people who in 2009, when Barack Obama wanted to create warmer and better relations with Iran, were saying, no, 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 you can't talk about these large issues. Let's restrict this just to the nuclear issue. That's the most urgent issue. That's the only thing that should be talked about. And so Obama actually had to respond to this very high-pressure campaign. When you look at the history, that's exactly what happened, and I detail this in my book. He had to respond to this pressure campaign by limiting his conversations with Iran just to the nuclear issue. So it's often those same people now that turn around and say, well, that wasn't enough. It didn't go far enough. It's very obvious what the motivations are here. It's an anxiety about the idea of Iran being treated like any other country or being allowed into the community of nations.
Okay. Matthew, I want to turn back to you for a second. The former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, she recently tweeted over the weekend, she said that the Biden administration needs to realize that the world of 2015 is a lot different than 2021. What's different?
What's different is that the Obama administration went out of its way to lie to our Arab allies, which is most of the Middle East, the Sunni countries there, and our best ally in the Middle East, which is Israel. We lied about being having any negotiations. Apparently, Israel had actually knew that from early on that the U.S. was having these kind of contacts. And so what the Obama administration did with Europe, China, and Russia was to create a nuclear framework for this deal, which again, as I argue, does not work. But they did so without taking into account or even consulting with the people on the ground located next to Iran who this would affect the most. Now, because of the Trump administration's policies, the Abraham Accords is now a real thing that has allowed a warming of relations between Israel and other Gulf countries, and there are other countries around the Middle East that are friends with the United States. These countries now will have a vested interest in making sure that whatever deal Biden dreams up will be strong enough to actually prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And as far as people not wanting Iran to have a seat at the table of the community of nations, of course that's correct. They're the leading world sponsor of terrorism. When Trump came into office, they were holding Beirut's capital, Syria, Yemen. These are, and Iraq for that matter, they have been spreading terrorism throughout the region. There is no reason that the United States should have warm relations with Iran under this regime.
John, I see you grinning there for while Matthew was speaking, but I sort of want to take a sort of a break and switch gears here. You know, the path to a possible return to the deal, or even a new deal, could be very different than the first time around. And the French president has hinted at exactly this. Let's take a listen to what Emmanuel Macron had to say, and we'll pick up our discussion after that.
I do believe that we do need to finalize indeed a new negotiation with Iran, and President Biden has a critical role. First, because they are much closer to the access to the nuclear bomb now than they were before the signature of JCPOA in July 15. Second, because we have to address as well the ballistic missiles issues, and we have to address the stability of the region. And this comprehensive agenda is to be negotiated now, because this is the right timing. And we have to find a way to involve in this discussion Saudi Arabia and Israel, because they are some of the key partners of the region directly interested by the outcomes with our other friends of the region, obviously. But this is impossible to fix the situation without being sure that all these countries are comfortable with this new agenda. But I will do support any re-engagement of the negotiation.
John, my question to you, I mean, does Israel, does Saudi Arabia need to be involved? And how will their involvement sort of actually affect how Iran plays its hand?
That's the question for me?
Yes. John.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question. I think all parties that are affected, all parties in the region deserve to have conversations. Frankly, they should have conversations with one another. They shouldn't and don't really need the French to be able to mediate these conversations. But of course, unfortunately, the politics of the region sometimes makes that complicated. I would love to see Iran sitting down with Saudi Arabia and even Israel one day and actually being able to talk about some of their shared concerns or disagreements in the region. You know, but I think that it's an interesting suggestion. I'd be curious to see kind of where that leads. I don't think it's inherently a bad idea. But I do think that when you talk about why Saudi Arabia needs to be part of a conversation about Iran's nuclear activity, it's hard to really understand why that would be. Saudi Arabia is not a nuclear power. It's not even close to being a nuclear power. It's many, many years away from being a nuclear power, if that's even something it's interested in. So I'm not sure why it should be a critical part of this particular conversation. And the idea that Israel's interests and concerns are not represented in Washington, I think, is probably pretty risible.
Okay, fair point. And we'll get to see who has more of a say or not. But one thing is for certain, the clock is ticking. And generally, oftentimes, a deadline can be sort of an incentive to act. And I'm sort of segueing into an important date. Holly, I want to bring you in. One such deadline, as you know, is in about 10 days on February the 21st, when basically Iranian lawmakers, the Iranian government has said that, you know, to the IAEA, your inspectors are no longer welcome. How does this play into it?
Well, first, I think it's important to note that, just to address some of the earlier comments, that this was a nuclear deal and that was the only mandate. There was no mandate to negotiate on regional issues, Iran's ballistic missile program, or human rights. It was purely a nuclear issue. But going back to your question, This date is very significant, and what prompted this date is actually the assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist at the end of November. In response to the assassination, which Iran alleges Israel's Mossad was behind, the Iranians had decided in parliament to pass a law that would basically restrict access to the International Atomic Energy Agency experts or inspectors that actually monitor Iran's nuclear program. Now, having that been said, they haven't said that they're restricting all access, just certain areas. And this is their way of pressuring the Biden administration and also responding to the pressure they've been feeling since the maximum pressure policy started in May 2018 under President Donald Trump.
Okay. One other important event that could very well determine how this all plays out is the presidential elections that are scheduled to be held in June. And I think it wouldn't be unfair to say that the hardliners actually are holding the upper hand here. John, if a deal is somehow reached or some progress is made, do you think the hardliners say, oh, all of a sudden, we have a race here?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, those are the stakes here. And that actually is a real reason for some degree of measured optimism. I think one thing that all three of us can agree on here actually is that, we want to see some sort of peaceful, positive resolution that lowers the temperature on all of these things. And I actually think that here's some good news, right? So you have the the Iranian election coming up in June, as you say. The hardliners are in a very strong position because, frankly, the current president, Rouhani, and his reformist-minded foreign minister, Javad Zarif, have been humiliated by the collapse of the nuclear deal, by Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal. This was their flagship signature foreign policy achievement, and they've been made to look bad. The hardliners now have a very convincing case that they make to the Iranian people, which is to say, you see, you can't trust the United States. Now, if that gives Rouhani and Zarif a very strong incentive for wanting to salvage this in the few months that they have left. As you say, he's term limited. He's not going to be able to stand for re-election in June. So if they can turn this around and re-enter the deal, then they take away that rhetorical weapon from hardline anti-American elements in Iran, which I think is what we all want. At the same time, in Washington, Biden administration, a lot of the people in the new administration personally were involved in the negotiation of the JCPOA and have a real stake in seeing it not completely destroyed as well. So, and many of these people know one another. They've worked closely with one another on the issues. They know the technical details. They could stay up until the wee hours debating this stuff with each other. And I think they all have an interest in trying to see it resurrected. So I think that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that time is very limited. With the election coming up in June, the campaign will kick off in March or April. We only have a few weeks for any meaningful progress to be made. And of course, there are important American allies like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, like the Emirates, that will be not standing by idly, that will have something to say about all of this.
John, I want to get Matthew in here. I mean, do you agree with John? I mean, does it matter who wins the elections in June in Iran? I mean, whether it's the reformists or the hardliners?
2 points, but it's a different spin on what he just said. Yes, most of the people who were in charge of putting together the JCPOA back from 2013 to 2015 are back now under the Biden administration. They have staked their careers and their reputation on the fiction that the deal is actually good. They are absolutely dedicated to resurrecting it. Now, what we'll see by June, and here, just what I imagine we'll see happen is easy to predict, I think, because we've already seen it before. It's the fake argument of the headliners versus the moderates, especially when it comes to the presidency. Rouhani was elected, right? And this was something that the Obama administration made the point. They lied about. They even admitted later, like Ben Rhodes admitted, that that was just the issue that they used to tell the American people that there was a window of opportunity to negotiate with Iran because a moderate Rouhani was now the president. So what you'll see is the same argument from the same people who created the same failed deal in June. This will be the impetus for Iran to have a, quote, moderate president. Between now and then, you'll see the United States have some form of negotiations with Europe behind the scenes and try to see what they can get to with Iran. But make no mistake, the Biden administration will come to the table. And also bear in mind, whatever deadlines you hear from Iran about, well, now the deal, we must be in the deal, otherwise we kick everyone out. These are fake deadlines.
Matthew.
They can, of course, play with allowing access for the IAEA, but that doesn't matter. The deal is so good, Iran can't live without having sanctions relief.
All right, Holly, I have about less than a minute left in the show. I want to give you the last word. I mean, your thoughts on it, and do you think that Joe Biden's victory might have been a disappointment for the hardliners? I don't have a lot of time left.
Certainly. Actually, the hardliners saw it as a problem for their upcoming election strategy in June. They actually believe that if the deal is revived, it might actually hurt the chances of a hardline candidate winning the election, because that would mean that the Rouhani administration had secured sanctions relief, and that would mean that the economy would be improving, and that would mean that there would be a little bit of hope in the country, and therefore maybe a reason to bring back another reformist or moderate in power.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time. Holly Dagres, Matthew Brodsky, and John Gazvinian, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. All right, thanks for watching and see you next time.